The movie kicks off on a dark beach where a massive group of college students is throwing a wild party. As the music blasts, they drink and continue in the atmosphere. To keep things under control, Mitch, one of the boys, tells everyone to drop their phones into a bag in order to avoid any unwanted photos being taken throughout the night. Moments later, two students, Vance and Gilbert, arrive carrying something strange. It was a bizarre, pulsating ball of goo they had discovered floating offshore. Curious and slightly disturbed, they debate what to do with it. They finally settled on burning it. But before they follow through with their plan, a sudden argument between others takes their attention, and the mysterious object is forgotten, left near the fire as the party rages on. By morning, the beach tells the story of the previous night. Kaylee wakes up inside a lifeguard stand next to Mitch, feeling awkward over the hazy memories of the night before. A short distance away, 4 of their friends also wake up crammed inside a car, while Marcia is already sick and vomiting on a table. The party is over, but Kaylee soon notices that something is off. The beach is unnervingly silent with abandoned items scattered across the sand, and there's not another soul in sight besides the group. As Kaylee scans the area, a bird lands on the sand nearby only to get stuck in the sand. Moments later, Kaylee sees that the bird sinks into the ground and gets completely swallowed. Horrified by this sight, Kaylee realizes something is terribly wrong, and she immediately tells Marcia to stay away from the sand, but it's too late. Marcia's feet are already stuck in the sand. She panics and tries to move, but she only sinks deeper. When she reaches out to pull her leg, her hands get trapped too. From the car, their friends assume it's just a prank, until the screams turn to desperate cries. Vance, unable to ignore her distress, jumps out to help. But after only a few steps, he is also trapped in the sand. As he begins to sink, his screams intensify as the unseen force below starts to devour his flesh. Although Mitch throws him a buoy tied to a rope towards him, it lands a few inches short. They continue to watch in horror as Vance's skin is peeled off by the thin, hair-like tendrils from the sand, which eventually pulls him down. The group watches helplessly as both Marcia and Vance vanish into the sand. Panic immediately sets in, and when they remembered that their phones were taken away from them by Mitch during the party, their fears get worse. They also discover that the car battery is dead, meaning that the group is isolated with no way to call for help. In an attempt to try to understand what they're up against, Kaylee hovers her hand just above the sand. In response, tiny strands rise up as they sense her presence. The realization hits them that something alive is hunting them inside the sand. Just then, Gilbert finally wakes up and discovers that he is trapped inside a trash can where he must have passed out the night before. Clueless about the nightmare unfolding, he starts shouting angrily at the others. But when they tell him that 2 people are already dead, he immediately freezes as the gravity of the situation sets in. Whatever is lurking under the sand is real, and it's deadly. He tells them that his body is sore from being stuck for so long, but Mitch reminds him that in a few hours, the tide will rise and push him toward them. Meanwhile, Kaylee drags Mitch into the lifeguard stand, while Jonah watches them with jealousy. So, Chanda tells him that he needs to let go because Kaylee was his ex. In the meantime, the mysterious strands creep toward the car tires while Kaylee and Mitch scan through a cooler in the lifeguard stand and find alcohol. With no rescue in sight and the sun intensifying, they start drinking. The people in the car try to shield themselves with a towel. Eventually, Kaylee gathers the courage to ask Mitch about the previous night, but Mitch reassures her that nothing had happened between them and that they had only talked. Moments later, they find sunscreen in the stand and Mitch gives it to Kaylee, who throws it toward their friends in the car. As the group pieces together their memories, they come to a horrifying realization. The other partygoers never actually left, they were devoured by the sand. Everyone is overcome with emotion except Gilbert, who starts panicking as the heat burns his skin. Then, Jonah throws him the sunscreen, and it temporarily eases his distress. Just then, Kaylee notices that the mysterious goo ball from the night is now dried up and split in 2. Ronnie tells them that it looks like something hatched from it. Then they realize that this wasn't just a strange ball. It was an egg. The creature that had emerged from it is the same entity now consuming people. Since it was only born the previous night, Kaylee speculates that it may not yet be fully grown. To test its reach, she grabs a sausage from the cooler and tosses it onto the sand. Immediately, the strange tendrils lash out and pull it underground. The group repeats the experiment with more sausages, observing how far the creature's reach extends. The tendrils continue emerging, confirming the monster's presence beneath them. With the last sausage, they attempt to identify a safe zone. They find a small area safe from the monster, but it is dangerously far from them. Desperate to escape, Jonah grabs 2 surfboards from the back of the car and throws them onto the sand. The monster does not react for the board, confirming they are safe to step on. He cautiously jumps onto the boards and alternates between them as he begins to move across the sand. Kaylee warns him to keep his fingers away from the ground. Then, Jonah suddenly stops, and instead of continuing forward, he turns to the group and insists they need to have a serious conversation. He calls out everyone who cheated the night before. His friends protest that survival should be their priority, but Jonah refuses to let it go. When tension starts to rise, he eventually continues to move. But as he reaches for the bench, the board slips, nearly sending him tumbling. But he manages to grab onto the bench at the last second. Meanwhile, his friends notice the creepy movement of the monster's strands, pulling the boards away. They call out to Jonah, urging him to return, but Jonah insists he can still save himself. Suddenly, the strands surge beneath him, brushing against his stomach. However, he quickly reacts as he makes a desperate leap, landing on top of the table just in time. Meanwhile, the attack leaves bleeding wounds across his tummy and soon, a wave of dizziness washes over him. So, he lays down and tries to regain his senses. Moments later, Jonah snaps out of his daze and groans in pain, describing it as being stung by 1,000 jellyfish. Though the wounds aren't deep, Ronnie quickly concludes the strands must be poisonous. Determined to find help and safety, Jonah spots a bag on the bench. So, he drags himself toward it and searches through its contents. He finds some food but accidentally drops a banana. To his surprise, it doesn't sink. Curious about this, he picks it up, then lowers it back down as he realizes that the monster only emerges from the sand while avoiding the bonfire's area. Testing his theory, Jonah jumps off the bench, landing on the fire's remains and nothing happens. So he declares that the monster doesn't like fire. Jonah celebrates this finding as he eats the banana. But his wounds begin to ooze pus, sending a wave of horror through him. Kaylee tries to keep him calm and tells him to get back on the table. When he reaches the table, Jonah searches the bag again and he finds some drinks. He begins tossing them to his friends, one by one. But as he throws the last can, the bench cracks beneath him and his wounds tear open and more pus and blood ooze from them. The pain was excruciating as he let out a scream. He grit his teeth and forces himself to move, barely managing to climb back onto the table. Meanwhile, the surfboards continue to shift on their own, dragged away by the monster. Gilbert calls out to the others and asks about their phones. They were in the trunk of the car. So, Ronnie immediately reaches for the trunk, trying to pull up the back seats, but they won't budge. She changes plans and attempts to stand on the bumper to open the trunk. Before moving, Ronnie turns to Chanda and tells her to give a letter she had written to her mum in case she doesn't survive. Then, gripping Chanda's hands for support, Ronnie carefully crawls onto the trunk and lowers herself onto the bumper. Meanwhile, Jonah is now unconscious, and Gilbert is barely holding on as the heat drains his strength while the can cuts into his skin. Ronnie finally manages to fit the keys into the trunk lock. As she lifts the lid, she suddenly slips and nearly falls to the ground. She catches herself just in time and tries again. But as she pulls, the lid snaps against her legs, making her lose balance and land on top of the trunk. The trunk closes once more. Kaylee then observes the width of the trunk and realizes Ronnie will have to lean back to succeed. So, Chanda and Ronnie quickly roll up a towel, hoping to use it as a makeshift rope. But it's still too short for Ronnie to both lean back and open the trunk. That was when Mitch and Kaylee remember the rescue hook inside the lifeguard stand and pass it to Ronnie. However, the movement is dangerous and the car trembles under her weight as the monster's tendrils start piercing the tires, making every second more dangerous. With extreme caution, Ronnie finally manages to unlock the trunk. But just as she reaches for the phones, a blaring car horn shatters the tense silence. The sudden noise startles her, causing her to lose her balance, and the trunk lid slams shut and traps her fingers. She screams in pain while the others frantically wave their arms to the approaching car. The patrol car eventually pulls up near the stranded group, where Jonah lies unconscious, and the situation is growing more desperate by the second. It was Officer Alex from the beach patrol who casually lowers his window and informs them that the beach is closed and that they need to leave. But when the group urgently tries to explain the horrifying reality they're facing, Alex brushes them off, assuming they're just drunk and causing a scene. Completely dismissing their warnings, Alex steps out of his car and walks across the sand. Fortunately, his heavy-duty boots protect him from the creature as its deadly strands are unable to pierce the thick soles. He first checks on Jonah and Gilbert. Seeing Gilbert's large frame and the crude drawing on his face, Alex mocks him before attempting to pull him free. When his attempt fails, he moves on to Ronnie and tries to release her trapped fingers, but that also proves futile. Growing impatient, he mocks them further and accuses them of being high. Kaylee, who is now fed up with his arrogance, fires back at him. In response, Alex, who has become frustrated by their actions, marches over to the lifeguard stand, where Kaylee and Mitch are, and demands that they come down and even threatens them if they don't comply. As tensions rise, he reaches for his pepper spray, but in doing so, he accidentally drops his car keys. As he bends down to pick them up, his hand is immediately stuck in the sand. Kaylee quickly tells him to try using the pepper spray, and when Alex attempts using it, the creature recoils, releasing him for a time. However, it had already partially devoured his arm. Horrified by the sight and in agony, Alex tries to pull away, but the creature pulls at him once more, and this time, it starts to drag him into the sand. Screaming and writhing in pain, he disappears into the sand as Ronnie, now within reach of the pepper spray, retrieves the canister as Alex finally vanishes into the sand. Moments later, Mitch thinks about the scenarios that just played out and realizes that the boots had offered Alex some protection. So, he quickly removes his flip-flops and asks Chanda for towels to wrap around his feet. He manages to catch one, but just as he reaches for the second, the railing collapses, and he falls to the sand. The creature strikes immediately as its tendrils coil around Mitch, tearing into his skin. The others can only watch in helpless horror as Mitch is consumed and his body is dragged below, leaving nothing behind but a blood-stained patch of sand. Moments later, Kaylee notices the monster shifting the broken railing. Acting quickly, she tells Chanda to grab it. She then deliberately breaks more sections, tossing them down along with the towel. With no other options left for her, Kaylee takes a desperate risk and drops towards the car. Miraculously, she lands on it and she immediately lashes out at Chanda over her betrayal with Jonah. However, Jonah apologizes to Kaylee, and he tells her that he still loves her. Meanwhile, Gilbert, who is now very weak and battered inside the can, musters his remaining strength to reposition himself for better communication with his friends. Unknown to them, the monstrous strands were gradually creeping toward the scent of fresh blood. The group then turned to help Ronnie as Kaylee and Chanda managed to free her hand before wrapping it tightly with a towel. Then, using pieces of the railings, they create a makeshift bridge across the sand. Chanda cautiously walks across, explaining that she never actually did anything with Jonah. Upon reaching the table safely, Kaylee follows suit to reunite with her boyfriend. Ronnie, the last to cross, hesitates when she notices the blood dripping from her bandaged hand. The distraction causes her to lose her balance and fall. Acting fast, Kaylee sprays pepper spray to delay the encroaching danger. For a moment, it seems like Ronnie is safe, but as Kaylee grabs her arm to pull her up, the monstrous strands latch onto Ronnie's other limb and drag her down into the sand. The others watch once again in horror as she vanishes into the sand. Realizing they need a new plan, Chanda recalls Mitch's idea and wraps her feet in towels. She then sprints toward Alex's car and manages to climb on top. Meanwhile, inside the trash can, Gilbert suddenly feels movement and starts to panic, but the shaking is brief. Just as he reassures himself that the danger has passed, he begins coughing up blood. Then suddenly, enormous tentacles erupt from the can, wrapping around his body and dragging him down, leaving only a gruesome trail of blood behind. Then, the monster turns its focus on Chanda. It violently shakes Alex's car, causing her to fall onto the hood and hit her head, sending her unconscious. She eventually regains consciousness later that night, and as she looks around, she spots a raft on top of the car. Taking it, she tosses it onto the sand and makes her way to the table, where she helps Kaylee drag Jonah into the vehicle. As their struggles rages on, the ground suddenly quakes, pushing Kaylee backward onto the raft. She scrambles to rejoin Chanda, but before she can climb back up, a glowing tentacle bursts from the sand and lashes out. Kaylee narrowly avoids it, but the tentacle shuts the car doors before vanishing into the darkness. Thinking fast, Kaylee climbs onto the vehicle's roof and grabs a gas canister at the back of the truck, but the creature strikes again and shatters the canister. But in doing so, the creature gets soaked with the gasoline. So, Kaylee quickly grabs the second canister and wets the surrounding sand. As the tentacle rises again to attack once more, she strikes a match and throws it toward the soaked ground. The flames erupt and engulf the monster in fire. It thrashes and screeches in pain as Chanda manages to open the car door, allowing Kaylee just enough time to dive inside. With the creature pounding against the door, the girls struggle to keep it shut. In the end, the beast eventually retreats and vanishes into the dark. Exhausted and heartbroken, the two girls finally realize Jonah didn't make it, and this overwhelms them as they break down in tears. By morning, a surfer eventually discovers the abandoned vehicle and knocks on the window. Dazed but alive, the girls carefully step out of the car where they eventually discover that the sand is now safe. The terror is finally over, or so it appears to them, because deep in the ocean, the monstrous creature swims away, searching for its new set of victims on another shore. And that's the story of the movie, The Sand, where a wild spring break party turns into a terrible nightmare. If you enjoyed this recap, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling us what you would have done differently. Until next time, stay safe.